Shana Tova, everyone. You know, one of the most disturbing things I have seen on the news in recent months was an interview with the leader of this country, who was asked a question about the death toll ongoing from the coronavirus epidemic, which at the time was 1,000 people dying every day. "It is what it is," he famously said in response. It is what it is. To my mind, that was one of the most callous and shocking things someone could say in a position of leadership to the reality of so much death in this society. It represents a total disavowal of responsibility for such a catastrophe. And in that sense, this was a breathtaking failure of moral leadership in our society. I bring this to us today, not in the spirit of taking sides. I would speak out like this no matter who sat in the Oval Office, no matter which leader in the world said something like this. As Jewish people, we have an obligation. We must speak out when such moral failures are so profoundly on show before us. You see, when a leader says it is what it is in response to such an event, what's really happening is that leader in the moment is feeling completely powerless and out of control and is trying to be in total denial of that. And therefore, they simply say it is what it is. But what happens is, of course, is that sense of being out of control trickles down to all of us in our society and around the world. And we all now feel more out of control because we don't really feel like we have real leadership in the midst of such a crisis. To say it is what it is particularly painful for me as a Jew and as a rabbi to hear such stonewalling, such coldness. You see, we Jews are not really strangers to that kind of behavior, unfortunately. It goes all the way back to the book of Exodus. We all remember this story when Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh and they say, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go." And what does Pharaoh say back? He says, "Who is this God that I should let Israel go? I do not know your God, neither will I let Israel go." And of course, we read how 10 times, it says, "V'yechazek et lev paro," some version of Pharaoh hardens his heart in response to what is. And in that way, Pharaoh becomes the ultimate paradigm for all authoritarian leaders in history who seek to profit at the expense of those in their power. So when Pharaoh said, "I don't know your God and I won't let Israel go," he meant it. He meant it because he truly didn't care. And in his own way, he was saying, it is what it is. Now, this is particularly ironic in the book of Exodus because just a little bit before this whole series of events, we had Moses back at the burning bush. We all remember that story as well. And Moses is asking God, who's calling to him, and he says, "But if I go to the Egyptians, if I go before Pharaoh and I say, my God has sent me to do this, they'll ask, what is his name and what should I say?" And what does God say? God says, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." And you shall say, "Ehyeh has sent me to you." Now, what does Ehyeh asher ehyeh actually mean? Well, it's kind of tough to translate. I guess it literally means I will be what I will be, or I am what I am. And in a sense, it's possible to translate it as it is what it is. Now, this is particularly mind-blowing because here I am now asserting that it is what it is in fact a name of God. And yet, when it is being spoken by a leader of the world, it is the most horrible thing in the world. What gives? Well, of course, the answer to this is it depends on who's saying it is what it is. If a hard-hearted leader like a Pharaoh looks out at the suffering of the people in his kingdom and says it is what it is, as it were, well, that is quite literally what we would call a chilul Hashem. That is a desecration of the divine name. But when somebody like a Moses or somebody else who has an open heart looks out and sees the same thing and sees Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, and sees the name of God rising up, then all things become possible in that moment. And this is what I want to unpack in my words that I want to share with you today. In fact, it's this idea of it is what it is. Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. This is so central in Judaism. It's the basic building block for all of the mitzvot, for all that we know is the moral basis of Judaism in the world. The trick, of course, though, is that in order to understand that, we have to keep our hearts and minds open. And we have to make sure we lift up leaders who also have open hearts and open minds, and leaders who are not like Pharaoh. You know, I heard a very strange story on an NPR show not long ago. Very disturbing story. It was the story of this young couple that was driving on a highway, and they had their 2-year-old little girl in the back seat. And horrifically, the father lost control of the car, and he spun out of control into oncoming traffic, and a truck slammed into the car, and their 2-year-old little girl was killed. Now, what makes this story particularly bizarre is that it was the truck driver who was so horrified, so traumatized by this experience that he ended up suing the parents of that little girl who was killed. His reason being that he was so traumatized that he needed to sue, that this happened to him. And you know what? He won the case. Now, this is a fascinating story to me because it is so emblematic of the psychological and emotional reality of our time and of the society that we live in today. You know, that truck driver felt assaulted by what is, because this tragic reality happened to him. And he felt so incredibly horrified by it that he could only assume the role of the victim of this experience. And in that, he felt justified in suing the parents of that little girl who was killed. You know, it's like there's this idea that's becoming more and more prevalent in our world today. It's the idea that bad things keep happening to me. And when bad things happen to me, I am therefore always the victim. And my proof that I'm the victim is that I'm feeling bad. I'm suffering. And if I'm feeling bad and I'm suffering, therefore I get to have a grievance at whatever it is out there in the world that has made me feel bad, and I can sue and I can attack and I can create all kinds of strife. And the worst thing of all, the most disturbing thing of all, is that even if I played some kind of role in having a responsibility in bringing about the reason why I'm suffering, that doesn't matter anymore. You see, the only thing that matters is that I'm hurting, and therefore I don't have to take responsibility for that. And I get to assign blame to someone else. That's a profound distortion of the American value of the pursuit of happiness. That's something we all know well and we cherish here in our American society. But what it's turned into is, if you dare do anything that encroaches on my right to feel happy, then I get to attack you. Now, that's not the pursuit of happiness in my book. That is narcissism run amok. And we're seeing this behavior more and more in more elements of our society as we look around in our world today, aren't we? I believe that this sense of narcissistic victimization is what's behind so much of what we call white grievance in our day and age. It's also, if any of us have had one of those bosses that takes out everything on their workers who are less powerful than they are, that's another manifestation of this behavior. Or if you have that relative who always shows up and ruins all the family gatherings and makes everything everyone else's fault, you know what this behavior is. And if we really want to get honest with ourselves, we can all think of a time when we felt that we were the true and only victim and that we had a grievance and therefore we could shirk off responsibility and assign blame to others at the expense of others. We've all been there. So this narcissistic victimization is what the Torah means when it talks about a hardened heart. That's what defined Pharaoh. He had lived his whole life with such a sense of entitlement, with such a sense that things have to go his way, that if they don't, well, it is what it is. That's not his problem. And we see that in all authoritarian leaders ever since. They all have this stunted sense of compassion and empathy. And you know what? It's not just authoritarian leaders. We all have that propensity. It is a pitfall that is a part of the reality in human nature, in each and every one of us. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a Harvard psychologist who wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. And she addresses this issue, and she says something very interesting. She says, when it comes to our emotional experience of life, most of us really have it backwards. We look out at the world and we think something happens to us and it is what it is, and I'm feeling the way I'm feeling because of something that happened, and once I'm feeling that way, there's nothing I can do about it. Now, that idea is partially true, of course. If you are feeling bad, if you are suffering over something, then of course, there's nothing you can do about it, except you have to be kind to yourself. You have to take care of yourself. You have to find ways to help yourself to heal from those things and honor your feelings, of course. What Lisa Feldman Barrett is pointing out, however, is that the problem arises when we really think that's what's causing my bad feelings is entirely something out there in the world. She said, when you really start to investigate this, what you discover is that your emotional experience is actually being generated inside your brain. It's happening inside your head. And our emotional reality is being shaped by concepts that our brains are holding on to. And so our emotions are the effect of these concepts that can be triggered by something in the outside world, but they're really coming not from there, but from here. Right? So for example, if I say something cruel to you, you're going to feel hurt. That's certainly true. And I said it and you're experiencing hurt. But if you really start investigating it, once I've said what I've said, it's done, it's over. But the hurt that you are continuing to experience moment to moment now isn't coming from me anymore. It's coming from your brain, from your mind, right? It's being generated from within. Now, for many of us, this insight might be patently obvious. For some of us, however, this insight could be mind-blowing. That it's not what's happening out there in the world that's making you feel the way you feel. It's what you're thinking and believing in the moment that is what is making you feel what you feel. And this insight is the basis of this burgeoning field in our time known as cognitive behavioral psychology. It's the idea that, it's like our mind is like the projector and everything out there is the movie. And what we're doing is we're projecting our emotional concepts onto the world. And if you work on changing the movie in the projector, you're going to project a different emotional reality in the world, and you're going to have a very different experience of your life. Now, most of us have concepts about life that we just have had always, that we take for granted. And they may be very correct and very true concepts. But the mind-blowing thing here is that those concepts are just us. They're not necessarily written in stone out there in the world. It isn't necessarily is what it is. So for example, I could go through life having a very fixed concept of who I am. And I can have very fixed concepts of who you should be. right? Or who I want you to be, or who I need you to be. And if you don't meet my very fixed expectations of what I want you to be, then I'm going to feel like I might have an opportunity to lash out at you or to attack you. This is how the Pharaoh mind works. This is how a hardened heart can work. If we get too fixed, our hearts can turn to stone. It is a very special open mind and open heart that can learn to stay radically open, to not get stuck in fixed concepts without questioning them. That kind of mind then looks out and doesn't just see and say it is what it is. That kind of mind can look out and see Ehiyeh, Asher Ehiyeh, can see the presence of God, the voice of God rising up from what it is and respond with the fullness of their being. There's a powerful story told in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, describing Moses at the moment that the Israelites were engaging in the sin of the golden calf. And Moses was still up on the mountain with God. And when the Israelites start to sin, God says to Moses, Lech red, go, get yourself down, for the people are corrupting themselves. And according to Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud, at that moment that God said that, Moses froze. He didn't know what to do. He felt that there was nothing he could do at that moment. He was terrified. But then Moses was extraordinary. He broke out of his fixed ideas of what he could do and what he couldn't do. And suddenly he realized, Davar ze talui bi. This thing depends on me. And immediately there and then he rushed down and did what he could do to stop the Israelites from sinning. You see, so in that moment he broke out of his fixed ideas. He did not have a hardened heart. In that moment, he realized that the very noise of the Israelites sinning in the camp was the same thing as the voice of God. It was Ehiyeh. It was the voice of God rising up to him, calling to him, saying, Lech red, go down now. Davar ze talui bi. Everything depends on me. It all rides on our ability in the face of horrors of the world that we may know at this moment in history to stop ourselves from throwing our hands up and saying it is what it is, to stop ourselves from that. Because then we're no better than presidents who say that, no better than pharaohs who dismiss the suffering of their people who are enslaved. No, when we have the courage to open our hearts in that capacity, then suddenly all things become possible. This is what we mean truly in Judaism by a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment. And typically we say a commandment is something God on high is commanding you to do something. But it's really much more subtle than that. A commandment is actually what becomes the natural thing to do when we get rid of our fixed ideas and our narcissism. When we simply look at what is and see Ehiyeh and see the presence of God calling to us to respond. That's mitzvah. It's natural. It is a hardened heart that says it is what it is when thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying of a pandemic. It is a Jewish heart, on the other hand, to look out at the face of a pandemic and suddenly realize, especially if you're the leader, to say, Davar ze talui bi. This thing depends on me. And to rush down and to affirm publicly, I will do everything in my power to put a stop to this catastrophe. And you know what, folks? That's a mitzvah. We call it pikuach nefesh, saving a life, which is saving the world. That's the natural mitzvah that happens when we are open to responding. And that's how all mitzvot work. And we can hear Ehiyeh, the voice of God calling to us in all of the troubles of our times. When we see gun violence running amok in our society, we can either throw up our hands and say it is what it is, or we can say, Devar zeh talui bi. This matter depends on me, and I have to get involved, and I have to do what I can to make sure that there's sensible gun legislation. We can look out at the insanely higher percentages of people of color who are victimized by police brutality in our country. And we can either say it is what it is, or we can look at it and see ehiyeh, that this is the voice of God calling to us, saying, I have to do what's in my power, Devar zeh talui bi, to fix the system, to stop the violence. The same thing applies to our broken healthcare system. The same thing applies to what's happening to immigrants at our southern border. The same thing applies to our climate catastrophe that we are in the midst of. In all these things, it is ehiyeh. It is the voice of God calling to us right here, right now, not 3,000 years ago at Mount Sinai, but right here. This is how the voice of God calls to us. It is through what is. Every mitzvah is just a different name we give to that immediate response in the moment. And when we live our life this way, we start to notice something truly extraordinary. We realize that so many moments of our lives are moments that simply call on us to bless this life. That life calls to us to be of service, to be supportive to others. Life calls on us to speak truth to power, yes, but life also calls on us simply to recognize the miracle of life and to reach out to those in need who are around us. All of these things are the mitzvah that rises from an open heart to ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, to it is what it is in the best and most divine sense of the term. So we look out in our world now on this Rosh Hashanah. We see a lot of things that frighten us. But if there's any message I want to get across, it's don't throw up your hands. No, it's not is what it is. This is all a call to each and every one of us to act. We're not powerless in the face of all of this. We are infinitely empowered. Devar zeh talui bi. Let us all do what we have in our power to do, to reframe these catastrophes as a voice that impels us to move forward and to do what we can within the power that we, thank God, have been granted in our lifetimes. When we reframe in this way, then all good things and all healing becomes possible. Devar zeh talui bi. It all hangs on you and on me. May we all take this deeply to our hearts. May we keep our hearts open. And in that way, may we bring healing and transformation. And may this world be one of blessing for all of us and for our children and our children's children. And let us all say, Amen.